So what makes somebody successful in the CEO role is the opposite often of what makes somebody successful in a functional executive role, and that's you're a generalist, not a specialist. And so the key skill is your ability to hire and utilize expertise in other areas when you're not the expert. Whereas in a executive sales role, you're the expert, and it's about leveraging your specific skill set. In the CEO role, it's figuring out how to find the right people who are experts, how to manage those people, and coordinate them across all the activities of the organization.
Welcome to the Thrive Podcast, where we dive deep into tech entrepreneurship and strategic growth. I'm your host, Bill Potter, founder of Thrive Advisors, and I'm here to guide tech-led founders through the maze of challenges on their journey to maximizing enterprise valuations. Whether it's scaling your team, navigating market shifts, or unlocking new revenue streams, we'll explore actionable strategies, insights to help you thrive in today's competitive landscape. Join me as we uncover the secrets to strategic growth and success in tech startups. Hold on to your hats because we've got an extraordinary guest joining us today on the podcast. Get ready to become a leadership master along Joel Trammell, a true titan in the business world. Joel's resume speaks for itself. He's rocked the corporate scene as the former CEO of Blackbox Network Services and the brain behind Core Software. But that's not all. Joel isn't just about business. He's also a prolific author, churning out must-reads like The CEO Tightrope, The Manager's Playbook, and The Chief Executive Operating System. Brace yourself for an exhilarating conversation as we tap into Joel's wealth of wisdom and experience. Together, we're going to unlock the secrets of success in leadership. Welcome to the podcast, Joel.
Great to be with you.
So tell me, what inspired you to write Manager 360?
Yeah, so, the manager journey goes back to I was building a high-growth startup. January 1 of one year, we had 100 employees. January 1 of the next year, we had 200 employees. I did 252 interviews in that 12-month period to add 100 people, and that was very exciting. But then you start walking down the halls, and you realize that half these people have no history with the company. And what really challenged me was when we were at 100 people, I knew how my executive team handled people, and I could kind of keep a pulse on how management was growing across the company. But now at 200 people, suddenly there was this layer of management that I didn't really have any visibility into. And of course, these were the people that were managing the key individual contributors, the people who were building the product, the people who were selling the product, the people who were servicing the customers. And I kind of got panicked and said, boy, we need to do some management training here, because how are these people managing people? Is there consistency? Do they understand the vision and the values of the organization? And so I developed a 10-hour course that I required all of our managers to go through with me personally around how we were going to have a management philosophy at our company. And so that's where it really started. And then as I went to other companies and had other experiences, I found the same thing. People generally had no management training. They had generally gotten into the job because they were a good individual contributor, probably had a 4-year degree in their area of specialty, but then had moved into management just because a position opened and we're going to take the best individual contributor and try to make them a manager. And there was no thought process behind whether they would be a good manager, no follow-up, and no training to make sure they were a good manager. And I realized when you get to scale at a company, when you get hundreds of employees, really the quality of your company is driven by the quality of your management team.
Absolutely. So it's a bit of the Peter principle at work. You're promoting people to their highest level of incompetency.
Absolutely. And then they often in companies remain there because we don't want to fire somebody that was so helpful to us in every other role that they held.
Terrific. As we were talking before this episode, you come from a teaching background, so this is probably second nature for you to build these programs. And you were also telling me something fascinating that I've seen so often is that we work with entrepreneurs at our organization and grow them toward an exit strategy. But once you have built the company to a certain size, as you're saying, from going from 100 employees to 200 or more, so that training program that you put helps those executives make that leap, that transition to being a successful CEO. In terms of, uh, can you explain some personal stories or experiences that have profoundly shaped your understanding of leadership?
Yeah, so my first job out of college was in the U.S. Navy, teaching at what they call Naval Nuclear Power School, where we train the sailors that operate the nuclear reactors on all the submarines and aircraft carriers in
Mm-hmm.
the Navy fleet. And so, the teaching part was enjoyable and very interesting. I found that came to me very naturally. But what kind of fascinated me was how the bigger organization was run. And the Navy, like the military, has certain inherent issues. There's a big incentive to get to your 20-year mark, so it creates this layer of middle management who wants to change nothing because they're just
Mm-hmm.
trying to make it to 20 and get their retirement. And so I just kind of became fascinated with the problem of how do you run an organization at scale. And of course, when I got out of the Navy, no one was going to hire me at 25 to be CEO of any organization, and so
Right.
I had to start my own to kind of solve the problem.
Of course.
But I'm not, really in some sense the classic entrepreneur who had some big idea or likes building new things necessarily. It was more about I was really fascinated with this problem of how you run a large organization and make it effective.
So tell me, what are your evaluation between what makes a great CEO and an average one?
Yeah, so the nature of the job is very different than most of the jobs people have before it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So let's say you're a really good salesperson and you become a sales manager and you succeed at that, and then you become a sales director and move up the sales chain. Every time a problem comes to you, it's a sales problem.
Mm-hmm.
And you are kind of by definition the most experienced, knowledgeable person to solve that problem. So the way you approach that is you gather all the data personally, you analyze the data, you're the expert. You may have not seen the exact same problem, but you've seen something similar. The brain's a great pattern matching device, and so you make a decision, and you're probably going to make a better decision than anybody else. But I take you as a salesperson, sales executive, move you into that CEO role, and now 9 out of the 10 decisions coming to your desk have nothing to do with sales.
Exactly.
There's the lease in Poughkeepsie. And are
Mm-hmm.
you going to spend 2,000 hours necessary to become an expert on leasing? No. Okay, that's not going to
Yes.
work. And so it's just a change in the nature of the job. So what makes somebody successful in the CEO role is the opposite often of what makes somebody successful in a functional executive role, and that's you're a generalist, not a specialist. And so
Mm-hmm.
the key skill is your ability to hire and utilize expertise in other areas when you're not the expert. Whereas in
That's a great point.
executive sales role, you're the expert, and it's
Mm-hmm.
about leveraging your specific skill set. In the CEO role, it's figuring out how to find the right people who are experts, how to manage those people, and coordinate them across all the activities of the organization.
So, can you share what your approach would be to helping those senior executives to building and nurturing these high performing teams?
Yeah, so I start very basic. So I played tennis all my life, played college tennis,
Mm.
and when you look at the great athletes, they're always really good at the fundamentals. And I think we don't spend very much time even thinking about what are the fundamentals of the CEO job. And so we start when I do training with simple things like what's the purpose of a business? So I have a little quiz I give people. I say, well, law is to justice. Okay, the purpose of the
Mm-hmm.
law is to create justice. As medicine is to health.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, as business is to what?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and often people will say profit, and I'll say, well, no, business doesn't have to make profit. Sometimes we want to grow. Sometimes we want to do other things. What's the activity? And the real activity for business is creating value.
Mm-hmm.
And you're creating value, though, not just for the shareholders of the business. You're also creating value for customers and employees. And that creates what I call a triangle of tension, because anytime you give value to one of those groups, it is typically resources that could have gone to the other group,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you want to give employees more salary and benefits, that's something that could have gone to shareholders or could have gone to customers. And the same thing when you give something to customers or shareholders. And so there's this inevitable kind of triangle of tension that the CEO is constantly managing between what's best for the company or the shareholders of the company, what's best for the customers, what's best for the employees. And then one of the interesting things I point out to CEOs in that model is, where's the CEO's interest in that model? They're not there. Okay, the CEO's a servant role. You're serving the interests of the shareholders, the customers, and the employees, and your personal interests have to come second to be successful.
Fascinating. So going back to some of the common challenges you see CEOs face and how they overcome them, clearly it's that triangle. What other common challenges do you see?
Yeah, I think, most CEOs think, first of all, when they get in the job, a lot of them realize, am I the right person for the job? And so a lot of them are very insecure, like, and I often ask CEOs, if your resume came across your desk for a CEO position, would you hire yourself? And a lot of times the answer is, of course not.
Yes.
And so I say, well, then why haven't you gone out and added to your resume, seek training, seek advice, seek expertise, just like you would expect anyone that's applying for a position. If you want somebody to be an accountant, you would expect them to have studied accounting a little bit.
Absolutely.
Right? And but we don't, for some reason, expect that of CEOs, or we think they're, just by papal disposition, thou art a CEO, you've suddenly become qualified. And the truth is, none of us are qualified. If I think I'm a pretty good CEO, but I take over a new company tomorrow, I'm not qualified. I don't know everything I need to know. I need to go study the customers. I need to go study the employees. I need to understand my shareholders, all these things. And so, I think most CEOs don't understand that CEO is not the culmination. That's not where I stop. That's a starting process to learn how to run the business.
I'm a member of Vistage, if you're familiar with that, CEO Roundtable.
Yep.
Yeah, and one of the things that attracted me to that group was, where do CEOs go to talk to and get help?
Exactly.
And so I think Vistage definitely fulfills that function of being able to be in a room once a month to talk about identify and discuss and solve problems that they really can't talk to anybody else about. But one of your book discusses the importance of self-awareness for leaders. How can CEOs cultivate self-awareness, and why is it so crucial for success?
Yeah, so ultimately, as CEO, you're the ultimate person who works through people. You don't really do anything as CEO, right? You don't sell anything. You don't make the product. You don't do customer service, especially at least once you get to any scale in your business. And so your fundamental unit of operation is people. And, when I left college, I had an electrical engineering degree, and I could have described an electrical circuit in tremendous detail. I could have defined all the terms, resistance, inductance, capacitance, written mathematical equations. You might say I was fluent in electrical circuits. But if you had asked me to describe my best friend from college, now this was a gentleman I played tennis with during the season, then the summers we'd travel around to professional tournaments and play, spent a lot of time with this gentleman. If you had said, hey, take out a blank sheet of paper and describe this gentleman, his name was Alan, in a way such that I would understand his behavior. Now, I knew Alan very well, but if I had to take out that blank sheet of paper and describe him to you, I'd have been at a loss for words. I might have said something like, Alan's a people person, and Alan's smart, and at that point, I'd have run out of vocabulary to talk about people. And that's the first thing we do when we learn any subject is we learn a vocabulary, and we define a bunch of terms. But most of us, at least I never had a class where they told me, here's the vocabulary of how you talk about people, and specifically their behavior in a work environment, and how to manage that, and how to think about that. And so that's where we start in training, is giving people a language to talk about human behavior. And you have to recognize that in some ways your human behavior probably falls within fairly normal bounds, but on some axes, you're kind of weird probably, okay? And if you've been successful, matter of fact, the more successful you've been, the more you probably have some extreme behavioral patterns. But if you don't realize those things are extreme, when you deal with people who have a different behavioral pattern, it's going to be the famous men are from Mars, women are from Venus concept. You're just not going to be successful with those people. And, when you're running sales, you're dealing with salespeople. And so they probably have kind of similar characteristics to you. When you're CEO, you're dealing with everybody. And so you're going to have to deal with the whole host of human behavior to be successful.
You're going to have to adjust your
You're going to have to adjust your style.
leadership.
And you're going to have to understand how you impact people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a short story about that. I mean, it took me years to realize this. So I'm a very driven, very direct communicator, very short to the point. I would have people send me a 3 or 4 paragraph email. And this would typically be somebody who didn't work directly for me, so I didn't know them very well, but they had some question for the CEO, whatever. And, you'd read the first paragraph, and there'd be all this information. You're like, okay, why are they telling me this? And second paragraph, all this information. Third paragraph, all this information. Finally, at the end, they'd have a question. Hey, I'm thinking about doing X, Joel. Is that okay? And I would hit reply and type yes and hit send. And I thought I was saving them time. They had asked me a question. I had answered it in the most direct manner possible. I did not realize that about half the company thought I was being rude, harsh. I probably didn't read their message. I must have been mad at them or in a bad mood that day, because if they had sent yes to a message like that, that's what they would have meant. Mm-hmm. But they didn't understand that when I sent yes, it meant yes. Okay, no reason to interpret anything. And so that was one of those things that kind of light bulb moment for me, where I went, oh, wait a minute. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. Mm-hmm. And people hear through the filter of their natural behavior. And so that when you say something, they don't interpret it as you saying it. They interpret, if I said that, what would I meant by that? Mm-hmm. And that's where so much miscommunication happens.
Well, certainly high emotional intelligence is key in that role. When I work with investors, their rule number one when they're looking for what company to invest in is management,
Right.
because a great management team can fix a broken company. When you're looking to promote a CEO, you were saying oftentimes CEOs are promoted because they're top performers, and then
Right.
they're elevated into positions that they're not prepared for. What do you look for in terms of the early indicators of that leadership, of that candidate for CEO?
Yeah, I want people who are curious about all aspects of the business, that don't just see the business as sales, or we build a great product and they'll beat a path to our door, but are actually curious about all aspects of the business. And certainly you need people who can handle the role of being the key person, that can make decisions and be comfortable with it, that they're the person in charge. A lot of people are very good number 2 people, but you put them in the main role, and that's just not a role that they're comfortable with. So they have to be kind of have the intestinal fortitude or the grit or whatever to be able to handle that kind of position. And then I think they have to have a clear vision of where they want to take the organization. You just can't be in the role and say, oh, we're just going to keep doing everything the way we are, and that's just not going to be successful. And so I'm always looking for people who can communicate effectively a clear vision for the organization.
Where do you find those people? I mean, well, that's the big question. But I mean, when you're with your success, where have you typically found those omnipresent, self-aware, high EQ people?
Yeah, well, it's maybe more a question of where you don't necessarily find them, and what I see a lot of organizations doing. They'll interview people for the CEO role, and the person who kind of just presents the best, the salesy kind of guy, is the person they give the CEO job to, because he makes a good presentation. But that's not really the role, right? So I like diverse experience. I like people that have moved, that haven't just stayed in one specific career path and kind of just gone up the thing, that they've had exposure to other things. The 2 characteristics, I think you have to deeply understand how your product is made or delivered if you're a service company, and you have to deeply understand how the customer buys and why they buy. I think those are kind of prerequisites. So, for instance, if you came to me and said, hey, we have this jewelry company, we want you to be CEO, I go, time out. I don't wear jewelry. My wife doesn't wear jewelry. I don't understand why people buy jewelry. It's just not on my thing. I don't understand how jewelry's made. I don't, and I have no curiosity about it. I would be a terrible CEO of jewelry company. Now, if it's an enterprise software company, a B2B sales kind of activity, that I have some interest in and understanding of. But so they're you're not just a good CEO. They're the CEOs for the right fit as well.
I've seen time and again CFOs being elevated into the C-suite. What's your experience been with that?
Yeah, I think, CFOs, and again, unless they've had broad experience, tend to view things from the financial perspective, which is the shareholder's perspective. But they often forget there are these things called customers that you have to satisfy. They often look at employees as an expense item instead of an asset. And they're not willing to invest in that asset to make that asset more valuable. And so they can tend to be very structured in the way they approach things.
And risk-averse.
And risk-averse, which works very well if you're managing accounting types, does not work so well if you're managing sales types and marketing types, more creatives. And so, yeah, I think it's true. I mean, there's none of the functional areas to me are a perfect path. I'd rather see somebody that moved from CFO to sales to marketing than somebody that just advanced straight up a linear typical career path.
You had mentioned that they really understand the product. What about a COO, Chief Operating Officer? Have that been a successful transition path?
Well, I just wrote a blog post about this because people all the time are talking about COOs, and I'm not sure what a COO is exactly. Okay, so who works for? I know who works for a sales executive. I know who works for the CFO. I don't know who works for the COO. I don't know what their actual job is because there's operations in sales, there's operations in marketing, there's operations in finance. I think a lot of times when CEOs hire a COO, what they should be hiring instead is a chief of staff.
Right.
Because what they're really concerned with is they're like, I have these priorities and I want to make sure these things get done, but I don't have time to chase down dot the I's and cross the T's, and I need somebody to do that, and that's what a COO will do. And I think that's really a better role for a staff function, chief of staff, who's a strong senior project management type that can focus on the CEO's priorities, but doesn't have the reporting people under them. Is not a management role. It's a staff role that can help leverage the time and talents of the CEO.
Right, because CEOs typically don't have a revenue focus, and it's really difficult to make that transition. How do you balance the need for innovation and risk-taking while having the responsibilities of running a stable and growing organization?
Yeah, well, you've got to decide what the purpose of the exercise is from the beginning. So I'm always asking CEOs, what are we doing here? Are we trying to maximize valuation? Are we trying to maximize cash flow? We're trying to build, we just want a stable, we just need $200,000 in income every year to keep the spouse happy, whatever the case may be. You need to be very clear. I think a lot of people get confused because they want to do all things. Oh, yeah, we want to grow very fast, but we want to make a lot of money. Well, those are in opposition to each other. Every 10 points of growth takes, some percentage points off the bottom line because you're having to invest for the future.
Right.
And so you've got to be very clear what the goal of the exercise is. I've run VC kind of backed organizations where it was very clear. We want to sell this for a 10x return. Okay, well, that kind of lays out, how aggressive you need to be. Other organizations, again, if you're cash flow oriented, then, you can be much more conservative, and that's the right answer. But it's understanding what is your vision and what is your goals for the organization, and making sure those align with how you're executing.
When you're rapidly growing a business, or even when you're not growing it because of conflicts within the leadership team, how do you, what strategies and techniques do you use for keeping that management team high functioning? Yeah,
that's probably one of the favorite questions CEOs ask me is, I've got a sales guy and a marketing guy, and, how do I get them to get along? And I say that's like dogs and cats. They don't get along, they coexist, okay? Because I think it is important to understand they're fundamentally different animals. And so it's a lot in training your executive team to understand what their roles are, but also being absolutely clear on what everyone else's roles are. And we have a whole executive profile, the template that I use, that I have CEOs go through, that starts with some of what are the personality characteristics of that executive, so when you're talking to them how to engage with them. And then talks about what are the responsibility, what's their responsibility statement, what do they own in the organization, so it's very clear what their role is. And then we go into KPIs, what are the 3-4 measurable things that we're going to evaluate the performance of your group based on a continuous basis. And then we go into quarterly goals that may be improving some of those KPIs or launching new initiatives or whatever. And so if you're very structured that way so that everybody kind of knows what everybody's doing, they're clear. A lot of the times there's disagreements. It's because there's not clarity on roles. It's not clear what people are doing. It's not clear how people are being evaluated. And that causes people to get very uncomfortable, and that's where a lot of the challenge. But when you're clear on roles, you're clear on how people are going to be evaluated, then it becomes much easier. And then a third thing that I hate bonuses. I hate variable compensation. That tends to introduce all kinds of conflict because when an executive makes, let's say you give them 150 and there's a $100,000 bonus, they go home and tell the spouse they make 250. And then when Christmas rolls around and the company hasn't performed and the bonus isn't there, whose fault is it? Well, it's certainly not their fault. It's got to be Fred in sales or Joe, the CFO, didn't approve that expense or whatever. It's somebody else's fault, and that creates natural tension. So I'm a big fan of setting compensation at appropriate levels, but having it certain so people don't have that worry about what their compensation is going to be based on the performance of other executives.
That's fascinating because so many companies that I know drive performance through incentive, and
they think they drive performance.
They think they do it. Yes, that is so true. So many of our in our audience are tech-led entrepreneurs, typically in the SaaS field,
Right.
and AI is the hottest thing
absolutely.
today. How do you see that affecting organizational leadership going forward?
Well, it is certainly going to have an impact. I, about a year ago, sat down and wrote a letter to my kids and my employees and anybody that, I thought I had influence with, that said, hey, this is another one of those major revolutions. And I've seen, 3 or 4 in the tech space. I mean, I took my first programming class on punch cards doing Fortran. So,
Me too.
So I'm old.
And COBOL.
Yeah. We were engineers, so
Yeah.
we only did Fortran. But, and so obviously the personal computer, IBM PC, came out soon there, and that was a big revolution. And then we had the internet, and then we had mobile. And this feels like one of those big revolutions. The interesting thing about this one is a lot of those previous revolutions favored the STEM people, the math and science type, the programmer types. This one appears to actually favor the more English majors and philosophers. So I've been calling it the revenge of the English majors, But I also think, it never, these technologies never, change things overnight. It's going to take time. The way I think about AI today is, imagine you can hire some really, really smart kid straight out of college that lived on Mars. Okay? They're really smart, but they lack a lot of context to the world, right? And so when you think about the task that someone like that can do, they're very good. For instance, I write a lot of blog posts. That used to be a process of sitting down at a computer and writing for 30 minutes to an hour, sending it to an editor to then clean it up and make sure all the points, which was probably another 30 minutes or an hour. And the other day I did a blog post that was pretty good in 4.5 minutes. Went from transcribing it while sitting in my bathtub to having ChatGPT edit the whole thing and add some context and sent it to the editor. And yeah, he changed a few words and spiced it up a little bit, but the whole process was, shortened dramatically. And so there are certainly huge productivity gains that are possible that we're going to see. But at the end of the day, I don't think everybody's job's going away, or they're going to AI is going to take over the world anytime soon.
Not anytime soon. So, being an author yourself and coaching CEOs, would you advise CEOs to become an author? What has that done for you that would do for the average CEO to become a better CEO?
Well, I think there's a kind of a bigger principle here that is one of the life hacks. As I've gotten older, I've started to collect these life hacks that I try to tell my kids, and they don't listen to me. So I'm going to write them down in the book. So when I'm gone, they'll say, "Oh well, maybe the old man wasn't so stupid after all, right?"
Yes.
And one of those is writing things down and referring to them is hugely valuable from a thinking and productivity perspective. And so when you have to write things down, same thing with teaching. I mean, the main reason I enjoy teaching so much is because I learn so much when you explain your ideas to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Feynman was famous for talking
Mm-hmm.
about if you want to learn something, you explain it to an 8-year-old, and then you find out, well, that's not a very good explanation. You go back and do it again and again and again until you finally really have learned it. And so I think that's the activity for writing for a CEO is it really forces you to confront all the edge cases and make sure your ideas are really good. And the problem with as CEO is most people aren't going to push you on your own ideas,
Yeah.
right? They're just going to tell you, "Oh, yes, boss, sure," even though they may think it's the craziest thing ever. And so I think writing is a huge value to CEOs, either even in the form of short blogs and emails to the company and that kind of thing, as well as long form, obviously books where appropriate.
Terrific. In closing, so many of our tech-led founders in our audience, they're experiencing a period of stagnation. And so based on your experience of creating these high-performing teams, I'd love to get your insight, and I'm sure they would, as when your company is not experiencing that rapid period of growth, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, a couple of things that I've always done in my organizations that really help. One, I'm a big believer in getting the CEO and the executive team together in some off-site, whether it's just in a conference room or literally off-site on a quarterly basis. I always found myself so much invigorated by those conversations, and a lot of times it's the conversation that happens at dinner or whatever as people get comfortable and share things and share thoughts they're having and just that environment. The other thing I did in my organizations was I tried to bring in a new executive to the organization every 12 to 18 months because I realized after 3 or 4 years of running an organization, I had probably had all my good ideas. It was highly unlikely that driving to work that day, I was just going to have the next brilliant idea to move the organization forward. And I found that, if you bring in the right new executive, they have different experiences. They have different skill sets. They're going to see things with those fresh eyes and give you a way to, push the organization forward. So those are a couple of things that I thought, prevented things from getting stale in the organization.
That's probably especially true now post-COVID with so many remote staff, and even leadership is remote now.
Yeah, I don't think you can, build a high-performing startup team remotely.
Hmm.
Maybe if you've all worked together before but and I certainly also, I mean, the other thing I would not recommend any of my kids take their first job and be remote because,
Oh,
when
the
we
mentorship just isn't there.
yeah, mentorship doesn't exist, right? How did you learn and how did you even figure out, what you wanted to do and what opportunities there were and have the conversations with people who had been there and done that? And so, yeah, I think the remote environment, obviously, every company's different. There are certain jobs that can absolutely be performed remotely. But I remember 20 years ago, an employee came to me and he had this elaborate plan how he was going to move to Montana. And he could do his job just as well from Montana as he could from Austin, Texas, where we were. And he went through a few points and he had this long presentation. I said, let's just stop right here. I said, be careful, because if you convince me that you can do your job from anywhere, I might have someone from anywhere do your job. And he decided maybe that was the end of the presentation. He'd go back to his office. And I think, if really it's true that you can work from anywhere, then what you're going to find is CEOs are going to hire people from Pakistan or the Philippines or wherever, where they're just as smart and maybe a little hungrier than the American workforce. But I don't think that it largely, broadly, is going to be successful.
We our company, Message Broadcast, was formed in Newport Beach, California, and so our talent pool was Orange County, California, and not even LA County because it was too long of a commute.
Sure.
And we thought we were never prepared to go remote. We'd never had a remote employee, and so we had about 2 weeks advance notice that we better be prepared to go remote
Right.
because of COVID, and we had scheduled weekly meetings to find out how fast we would come back into the office, and we had one meeting. And then we realized during that meeting, we're not coming back in the office. But the silver, to your point exactly, is the silver lining there is that we opened up the geographic area upon which we could hire people.
Absolutely.
And so that was the talent pool to be going nationwide, and later when we were acquired by a foreign company to go worldwide was amazing. But there are challenges, as you said, and especially at the startup phase. I mean, it's one thing to be an established company, but it's another thing to be in a startup. And
Yep.
we advise early stage companies all the time, and a lot of them, because of COVID, are remote, and it's a challenge.
Absolutely. And it really puts pressure on your management approach and having a consistent system because, when you were all in the office, some of the things that you maybe didn't do that you should have been doing happened through hallway conversations and water cooler talk or going out to lunch, and the problems kind of got solved. But in the remote environment, if you don't have a pretty sophisticated management system over time, I think you're going to find the company struggles.
That's great. Well, I appreciate your time, and thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Thrive Podcast. I hope our discussion with Joel was insightful, practical, and applicable to the entrepreneurial journey. If you found value in today's conversation, please like, comment, subscribe, and share this episode with fellow entrepreneurs. Your support enables us to continue bringing valuable content to the community. Until next time, keep thriving. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.